Howdy. So, having worked very hard on a clothesline in the last video, I thought I would do some actual hands-on level design for a change. This is my Macedonia map in progress, which is not as I'd like it to be in many respects. I'm still getting the basic geometry in. I've got foliage in. I would like it to be denser. A lot of it sort of culls quite close to the camera, so there's more foliage in than you might think. But I want to finish off the basic layout before I start redoing stuff. The rocks is one thing I want to redo. I need to optimize a whole ton of stuff. The houses are not finished. Some of them have the basic shell in, but there's a lot more work needed. But it's coming together. It's beginning to feel a bit like a coherent place, even though it does need work. I'm just going to go to the top view. So this has come on a bit since I last did it. Let's just fix the LODs at 0, which means that the roads show up. So the problem is that with the top view, as I said before, the top view uses not the best LOD for the landscape, so the landscape is a bit more smoothed out than it would otherwise be, which loses the detail of roads and other things which are overlaid on it. Anyway, so here is the overview of the map. That's the main village area, and we just moved down to this bit. Now there are some bits which still need to be filled out. Having filled out some bits, I may well add some more buildings and structures and foliage, though as a design choice I had intended this part of the map to be relatively sparse and open, because if you spawn around these bits it's a shorter distance to the central objective, and I wanted to balance that by having it more open so it's harder to approach secretly or effectively. So you can see where there's bits still needing to be done. I think I'd quite like to finish off this bit inside that sort of ring road there. So I want to show you how, for better or worse, I've been making this landscape, and to talk about my ways of doing it, which are not the best. But that area in question is over here. And I can see there is foliage that pops in when you get a little bit closer. And I will be reworking a lot, but what I've got is a sort of not quite mountainous but hilly terrain, with placeholder buildings which are very much not complete. So I basically wanted to just show you my workflow, which could be improved. So with just manually editing landscape, I think, start this off in World Machine, which was a procedurally generated rolling landscape. I did some manual edits in there, but I found it's not effective as a way to get a final product. I think there are other programs, I forget the name, which allow you to do foliage as well. That's quite useful. But I find myself editing the landscape in the editor. And so there is, I suppose, at a large scale, some undulation. So there's a basic structure at a large scale, and the easiest thing is generally to work down in terms of scale. So I'm going to bring back my editing window. And sorry, just ran down the stairs and up again, quite out of breath. So the sculpt tool I use to get my basic shape, and start with a bigger brush to get a range of scales, because some of these bits of landscape are a bit sort of similar scale and not entirely realistic, but I'm going to try and do better on this bit. Not quite sure how I'm going to deal with that house. I wanted some kind of house there, so I'm going to roughly flatten that out. I may even actually flatten that out. And so where I need to make space for these sort of things, I would typically flatten and smooth around the edges. I normally work at a 200 size brush, which is the minimum size that will actually smooth things out. So that's just a temporary bit of editing there, but it'll take the rough edges off. I'm going to jump back up to a bigger brush, sculpt, and I want to push down some bits and pull up some bits, but not entirely without reason. So where I can, I want to simulate what World Machine and other things do, which is to look at erosion. So that tends to be channels down the hill. And I need to decide, do I want foliage there in areas or to be mostly exposed? And I think a little bit of foliage, but I'll add that in later. So I'm going to start by just taking that down to create a sort of undulating basic shape that's been eroded a bit. I may also want to define areas which are impassable to force people into certain routes. At this bit I don't need to do that especially. Around here I've used the rocks to define areas that can't be gotten past, and there's something wrong with the textures, they're going at a very low resolution today. And so I try to manually force into two routes to try and decrease the usefulness of this approach, being very direct. And but here I'm just going to go a bit more freeform, and I don't need to worry about channeling the player any particular way. So there's my little route down there. It doesn't have to be absolutely geographically accurate, but just as a starting point. And those little channels create areas where players can sneak through without being seen necessarily. And then a bit of lifting up the landscape. I try and create sort of flat bits where I want foliage. I may even do a bit of flattening and then smoothing. I try and smooth a bit, but not too much. You lose some of the interest. But with the larger brushes, I want a more smooth, undulating sort of shape, and then to tweak it at a lower resolution. So now I'm going back to my 200 size brush and doing a bit of sculpting. So this is more about just adding a bit of character, and it's a lot of iteration, so I'm just trying to make that more of a channel down there. And I use sculpting to roughly make bits flat, so I'm making this area a little bit flat for no good reason, and just trying to break up some of the larger areas where you'd otherwise get a big rolling shape, which can be appropriate for some maps and levels. With this particular landscape texture set, I am going very much for this sort of sparse, barren look, and I'm just going to start painting some of that in. I am manually painting in this sort of eroded texture on these steeper surfaces. I'm not doing it everywhere, I'm just doing it now to get a feel for the shape that I'm making. Just to also guide me, and then I can try and do something interesting with this channel. And I need to go around and smooth some bits where I've left it a bit sharp. I try not to have it too sharp. So there, you can see the angular bit there. I'm just going to just smooth that down a bit. And here, I just want to get a smoother transition to there. And here you can see the materials I'm working with. That's the basic grass texture. That's the default texture. And you can see here I have some landscape grass. It's not particularly thick because I'm having problems with performance, and it fades out not too far away. I have this layer which is essentially the epic forest floor texture from the kite demo, I think it is, and I've got some different landscape grass in there that just pops up a little bit more interesting foliage, and the performance isn't bad. It does fade off quite quickly, but if you overlay foliage on top of that, it just gives it a nice deeper feel. I've got a gravel layer which I'm using to define some roads. I need to go back and make this better. It's not good. You can see it tiling, and it's just not a very nice texture, but that will do for now. And I'm using that as the base layer for the roads, so that if you do get the roads disappearing at distance, which you've seen in the top view. Oh, let's turn the LODs to auto. At least you can still see where the road is. It's the thinking behind that, and also to give it a bit of a border. What else have I got? This is the eroded texture, and these are two actually 3 out of the interactive foliage landscape layers. So the last one of those is a more sort of barren, completely worn away bit, which I use to define paths, and also sort of flat bits where I don't want to just have a boring old texture, and I sort of merge them a bit. So that's creating a slightly, I suppose, damper look, and it sort of defines, gives a bit of contrast. I'm not quite done, I might put a bit of soil. So yes, another layer is the soil layer, which is one of the ones I've made, and it's quite intense, doesn't tile too well either, but I'm using this with a bit of landscape grass with pebbles and a tiny bit of grass for my sort of agricultural areas. I'm just going to undo that. And this one I'm not using, I want to delete, but I'm waiting till I finish before doing that. I might reuse it as something else. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 basic landscape layers. There's still quite a lot. I mean, these things are big textures. You don't want to have too much going on or you run out of space. But yeah, so just slightly defining these channels, you start to get a shape and a more organic feel to it. And you can see over there where I've used, as I said, the plain texture to define paths a bit. You can see it on the top view. You can see it better elsewhere. So there are more clearly defined paths. Just gives the players a visual cue, helps you work your way through landscape, because it's not always obvious which bits you can climb up, which bits you can't. And that's basically it. And then I try and do as much as I can with the basic shape, but you can then enhance it with rocks and foliage. Trees are basically cheap because we put trees places, everything looks good with a tree, looks much more real, and it blocks sight lines, makes it more interesting. It's very hard to make good landscape that's entirely open like this. It doesn't look a bit rubbish, but I'm trying to do that first, and then I'm trying to sort of mitigate some of the boring areas with the tree. I'm just going to do a bit more while there's a hoover going on in the background, and I'll come back. And one thing just to note is that I use a not very strong tool strength. Makes it easier to get the boundaries nice and smooth, and also what helps get nice transitions is to have materials that use height maps to interpolate between different materials. I haven't got that set up for these materials, as I don't think I've got the height map, but there's other ways to fudge it to get a nice blend, because otherwise here's an example of a not height map blended thing. You get very well, actually it doesn't look so bad as it normally does, but you can get quite awkward transitions, which if it's over a long bit you can see the grid structure. So what you want to try and avoid is having the grid structure visible. Let me just get rid of all that. And you can do that with these height map transitions, height blends, I think they call it. I might look at the actual material later. Okay. And here you can see I've been using a variety of materials to break up the border of a particular material, so the soil has not got such a defined border. I'm just going to put down a bit of vegetation so that I can get a feel for the scale. Here's a little garden for that house, quite Macedonian style. That's fairly flat, so it sits quite flat. Just going to do that a bit. I might go back and make some more cabbage meshes, which can make slightly more organic shapes. But that'll do for now. I guess we really like cabbages. Here I've been using the smooth tool to smooth, obviously, but it doesn't always work well with paths, and I decided to add a path there. So I use a flatten tool or manually bring down the sides or bring up the sides to get a flatter surface. And I want a bit more to the side of this path because I want to add a little fence. I'm trying to think what would make sense. Does it make sense to have this kind of shape? Would you want to have that shape? Would you just have that little cliff exposed? We're in a rural area, but it might still be nice to have a little fence. So I'm going to just take a break from the landscape work. I'm going to put in my spline tool, which I'm using a hell of a lot. Let's start that there maybe. And I'm going to go and replace it with some barbed wire. And I've got a little end piece I need to pop in. Maybe it's more of a 10 or 5. And yeah, then I can do the usual spline things, going up and sideways and twisting and turning to create a fairly rustic barbed wire fence. I'm just going to get the basic path in, then I'm going to tweak it. Which you can do by changing the, the roll, the yaw, and there's a little bit exposed there which I might just fix by filling in that bit of landscape. And I want that to go around there. To about there. Now, that's alright. Something a bit odd there. So let's just fill that bit of landscape in a bit. Now I think the key with the landscape stuff is to blend in the elements that are on it. So I wouldn't just leave the fence like that. I would change the material underneath it to accentuate it and blend it in. I would have used probably a lighter texture, but I'm using it for the path next to it. Now that's quite a lot of intense soil there, but I'm going to go over it again with this, which will just take the edge off it. And I'll use a bit of that for the slope as well, because it's quite a steep slope. With a little bit of this texture at the transition. does not do well on a slope because it's only using the XY coordinates for the texture, so it gets stretched out on the Z axis. You could use a try something texture to fix that with the world coordinates. Can't remember what it's called, but actually if you just smooth off the slope you'll get a slightly better texture. Still a bit heavy on the soil there, so I'm going to just lighten that up. This path doesn't really go anywhere, doesn't make a huge lot of sense, but let's send it around there anyway. And let's join that up with that path, which means we've got to smooth it off so the gradient's not too big. I think I'm going to manually just dip that down a bit. And then use the smoothing to neaten that up. And then use the texture to reinforce that that's a path. I mean, that's a bit much for the path because you wouldn't see that much activity there in real life probably to create that path, but I want to give some cues. And then I think I'm fairly sure that's going to stay there, so I'm going to make that a bit of a bare slope. And just putting in these little manual cues. And I'm going to use a bit of soil for the flatter areas. So I'm slightly reproducing what World Machine and that lot do automatically. Different textures given different gradients and different areas, so that would be where the erosion builds up and makes soil, and just manually kind of redoing that. And I'm doing the best I can before putting in any rocks. I want this to look like a plausible landscape, and then I can add to it and make it better by using rocks. That's a slightly boring slope, I might jazz that up a bit. But with the path there, that's definitely going to be, well, wrong texture. Definitely going to be a slope that's going to stay there to divide the paths. And so at the sort of micro level, just going to bring some bits up, some bits down, which gives it more of a real feel. And back to time lapse. And here I'm going to drop another spline wall just to, again, the plausibility to make this look more like an actual house. You'd probably have a boundary fence. And let's just find our fence. So I have in mind a rustic wooden fence with two variations which work quite nicely together. I'm going to change the random seed and just drag that off a bit more. I don't want to make bits too cut off from each other, because I want there to be some interesting movement options, and I want people definitely to be able to fit around there. So I'm just going to get a, where have you gone? Dummy character. So that's not too generous, but that's enough to walk down, that's fine. Going to fill in that bit, smooth it off. Now what I might do is to make an opportunity for people to get out of there by adding a special piece which has enough space just about for people to get through. I may change this for a different kind of variation, maybe the fence collapsed, but that for now should let people get out the back of this house. And yeah, so that's coming on, and again I need to tie it in with the landscape, first of all by making a distinctive bit there and using perhaps this one just to go around there, and I need to do this extension. And this house is just a placeholder, but you get the idea more now. And I'm just going to pop to the foliage to what I like to do is add a bit of cover there so that it's not so glaring, that bit of the fence, but if you know what you're looking for you can find it. And yeah, it's not quite done. I think I would, for example, want to do more in this area, so I'm looking for sort of underdeveloped areas with lots of the same texture, and I want to break it up a bit. But another easy way to do that is to start throwing rocks in and foliage. Like I said, I want to do as much as I can before I do that. And I may go back and refine this landscape a bit, but this might do for now, certainly for the purposes of what I'm showing you. This bit here needs more work, but I'm going to come back to that. And I'm going to use a bit of soil texture to break that up. That needs a bit of work there. And then where I've put soil texture, or this forest texture, I then tend to stick a bit of foliage on. And I'm going for a sparse look. This is in keeping with the original look of the map. And I'm trying to make sure that it doesn't look like I've just plonked down foliage. So actually if you cluster it, it looks better than just uniformly spreading it across. Got a little bush here, and in these sort of valley areas where you might get more moisture, you get more foliage. So I'm trying to think about what happens in real life. Just to break it up a bit, this is a small version of that. So also a bit of cover, and I've got a very limited selection of rocks. The reasoning was that I was going to use instance meshes and keep that to a minimum. They're not a very good set for this work. They just don't really work with this landscape, so if I have to redo them all, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. But you have to be creative in ways to make them look different to each other despite being the same mesh. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. So that looks a bit odd as it is. Might put a slight squish on it to further disguise it. I'm trying to slightly align it with the landscape. As I said, you've got to blend it in with the material, so with the landscape. So there's two aspects. One is I tend to just lift the landscape round it, just because that's what happens with rocks. It doesn't erode away quite so much near them, just might smooth it out a bit. And then I'm going to paint around it, and the soil one is quite good for sort of picking it out, and that's a little better blended. And again, need to try and cluster them in the same sort of area, which is a more natural formation than just dotting them around randomly. This mesh is too distinctive with that groove, it doesn't work so well, but I'm going to still roll with it. Just going to fill it in a bit, lift it out a bit, maybe make it a tiny bit bigger, and then go around that one, and then join the areas up a little bit to, do that. And that then becomes quite ripe for a little bush, maybe. And then make sure they're not the same size. And I've got, so these bushes don't cull. They are used for cover, they do not cull. Other foliage is used to try and make it look pretty. Let's get some of these in. This is from the interactive foliage system. I'm just going to try and do a natural distribution, though daisies do tend to go on weathered bits like paths. So again, trying to be sensible with where you put it, and just to give a bit more interest in that area. Really looking for transitions and making them seem a little bit more natural, and trying to have different foliage in different bits of the map to make bits more distinctive. So this stuff you don't see from a distance, but it gives it a slightly better vibe. Closer up, long grass. I've got a hell of a lot of long grass. Which again just helps to make these areas a bit more alive. And I'm trying to get a bit of this stuff in the areas where there's other foliage, so it looks a bit less odd to have bushes just by themselves. And to again try and border paths that the players may go up. I may have to scale this stuff back as there's quite a lot of it, but it is cold at a short distance, so it will probably work okay. It just takes quite a long time to build the line maps. And I'll iterate a bit with that sort of stuff, just to slowly bring the landscape to life. And if I really want to cheat, I'll stick a big bush or some a tree in. Birch, why not? So I'm going to try and find a sensible place to put that. Maybe even in the garden, or maybe here. Let's try there. And I think that starts to tie the landscape together a bit. You can't have too many trees because the performance goes down, obviously. There's a sapling. Might drop it in there, just to get a bit more variety. That's an area that needs some foliage, I would say. And I might put in a bit of... Nah, it doesn't really fit there, it's too bright. So ferns tend to be in shady areas. Let's put in some of these. a bit more over here. I've used only a small subset of the foliage in the interactive foliage system, but I don't want to go mad on textures. I'm not sure they work there, but I'll put them there for now. And also it's quite nice to use foliage to break up fence lines. And I might put one of these little bushes just the other side there, also to give a bit more cover. To people going along that road. Maybe a bit more clustered there, and again changing the sizes so that they look a bit different. Not sure that entirely works. I'm going to take that one out. And if I have more time, if I have the performance available, I will be adding a lot more foliage, but I just don't know if I have that yet. I'm going to add them there just to create some interest. So I try and put foliage where people are going to go. Because this stuff culls, when you zoom out, everything looks a bit more barren. But I am going for that sort of barren look. And I think I'll put a few more rocks in. One thing I do is to use this one. I need to scale that down a bit. So again, thinking how you might embed that in the landscape, there's a few different options. I find it works better flat. Going to raise it up and do my usual trick of sculpting the landscape to fit. And then I'll give this one that sort of outline for a drier sort of look. And I'm just going to check with my man whether that is a decent bit of cover. You could crouch behind that, get a bit of cover, certainly on that side, but I think I might make it a little bit more useful. So that is now a useful bit of cover. And I might put a bit of rock near it just to give it a better look rather than to be functional. And I'm going to turn that around so that I can make it look a bit different to the rocks that were there before. And I'm going to paint it and sculpt it. So that could be refined, and it's not quite finished, but that is how I make my landscapes and fit them in with bits of this. And my pièce de résistance, of course, will be my clothesline. Let's find it. Oop. So there we have it. I'll move that out a bit. And when we look at the top and set the LODs again, you can see it now looks a little bit more finished and the piles are a bit more defined. Okay, bye bye.